and we will get
Can I make a face?
underway. You can make a face, yes. Thank you. Okay, so I'm Steve Schwartzberg. I'm running for the United States Senate as an independent candidate, and what I thought I would do tonight would be to talk about some of the reasons why I'm running, some of what my vision for the country is, why Christian nationalism is, in my view, the largest and most significant obstacle in the way of that vision for the country, and then offer an alternative. The alternative I try to sort of print it out as a 10-page read. We'll see if it gets read out loud or not as this goes on. I'll talk for about 10 minutes and then read for about 10 minutes and then open it up to discussion with Matt and Luther. Luther is the pastor of worship and spiritual formation at Lighthouse. Matt is the senior pastor at St. Paul's. I am a member of both of these churches to my great delight, as well as a Jewish study group online that Daniel Rettenberg organizes. Let me get into why I am running. I think genuine self-government rests on love, belonging, and a sense of the sacredness of all life. And we are very far from that now, but we've been very far from that since before we were founded as a country. And so my question for all of you, and I'm serious, this is a serious question, I'd appreciate if people have ideas in the conversation afterwards, is how we get from where we are to where we want to be, where we ought to be. And I have some ideas on that or I wouldn't be running, but they're partial ideas, they're inadequate ideas, they're first steps. The most basic of these ideas is to say, we start by putting love and respect out into the world, and eventually love and respect will come back to us. So the opposite of America first. Rather than putting ourselves first, we put others first, and the others that I'm most concerned with coming from my background are the peoples of the native nations of this continent, the peoples that we have wronged for so many centuries in such vicious and abusive manner. And so I would suggest that we start by looking for justice for the native nations, and a step in that direction is to cease claiming a right to dominate them and a right to steal their lands. We don't even think of it as stealing, we just take their lands. In 2014, John McCain put a midnight rider on the Defense Appropriation Act and stole what is sacred land to the Apache people at Oak Flat in order that it could be turned into a mine, into a strip mine. We just take it for granted that we can do this, that we have the right to do this, that we're sovereign, that the Congress has plenary power over the native nations. So the first thing to do is to cease that illegal and anti-constitutional, in my opinion, way of being in relation to the native peoples. The second item on my platform is a freedom budget to abolish poverty. In the 1960s, A. Philip Randolph, head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters for many years, suggested that after the Civil Rights Act and the Voting Rights Act of 64 and 65, the next step would be a national commitment to abolish poverty for all poor people in this country, regardless of race, creed, color, sex, national origin, opinion, whatever. That everybody who wants work should be guaranteed work, that there should be massive public investment in public housing, in education, in childcare, in the environment, and that in this way of public investment we can pull people out of poverty to the benefit of everybody in the community. The third issue that I'm running on is a version of Medicare for All that I call abundant care for all. I support Bernie's bill, I support Medicare for All, but I see it as a first step and not a last step. It is just the beginning of what needs to happen in the transformation of American medicine so that we're not only focused on disease, but we're focused on health and what the requirements of health are. All right, that's said too quickly as a general introduction. Why is Christian nationalism the greatest obstacle on the path of that vision? First, let me back up and talk a little bit about what I see Christian nationalism as being. I think there probably is many definitions of Christian nationalism as there are people in this country, but mine for what it's worth. I first really became aware of it in the context of writing a book called Arguments Over Genocide, the War of Words in the Congress and the Supreme Court over Cherokee Removal. So this was a story of the fight in the 19th century to try and prevent the Trail of Tears. And the chief advocate for the Trail of Tears was a Georgia senator named John Forsyth. And he said, and I'm quoting him, "All Christendom seems to have imagined that by conveying that immortal life promised by the Prince of Peace to fallen man to the aborigines of this country, the right was fairly acquired of disposing of their persons and their property at pleasure. Now, the Christian nationalism is hidden in that. Who has this right? Right? It's the American nation. It's the Christian people that constitute this nation that in this mythology have this right to dispose of the persons and property of the native peoples of this nation at pleasure. It is this ideology that the Supreme Court bakes into American property law in Johnson v. McIntosh in 1823, when it says that property in this country, original title in this country, derives from the fact that some representatives of a Christian people, that's the language of the decision, First Amendment, the representatives of a Christian people on this side of the Atlantic necessarily diminished the sovereignty of the heathens, that's the term in the description of the Supreme Court for the native peoples, necessarily diminished the sovereignty of the heathens and gave an ultimate dominion to the government of the discoverers of this land. That's the basis of property title in the United States. But we can push this back, this ideology of Christian nationalism, if we're really going for its origins, into the 15th century, into the papal bulls that sanction what become the transatlantic slave thefts and what become the land thefts and genocides in the New World. So in 1452, Pope Nicholas V says to Alfonso V, the King of Portugal, you can search out and subdue Saracens, pagans, and other enemies of Christ wheresoever placed, and reduce their persons to perpetual slavery. That is the ideological sanctioning of slavery. It is the womb, as Willie James Jennings puts it, in which race and modern racism are born. And by the end of that century, by the end of the 15th century, you've got Pope Alexander saying that in order that barbarous nations may be overthrown and brought to the faith, the Spanish Empire can conquer in the New World. So this ideology that becomes Christian nationalism is an ideology that sanctifies power and power's abuses. And it is criticized by Christians at the time. It's criticized by people like Bartolomé de las Casas, who says, look, this is evil, this is essentially anti-Christian, this is unlawful. Yeah. And the response to that comes from, embarrassed to say this as a historian, because he was a historian, the court historian Juan Gines Sepulveda. And what Sepulveda says, because he can't fight with Las Casas on the grounds of the gospel, he tries to. He says that, well, if you look at Luke 14, it says, compel them to come in. This king has a banquet, and not everybody who's initially invited shows up, and the king tells the servant to go out and collect them and compel them to come in. And so that's, in Sepulveda's view, justification for converting people by force and violence. But converting people by force and violence, this is not really in the Gospels, not the way we've learned it, not the way Las Casas thought of it, certainly. And Sepulveda realizes that he's in a weak position, and so he defends himself by saying, Spain is such a civilized power. It is such an accomplished nation that whatever it does is right. That's Christian nationalism, the way I see Christian nationalism. And I see a direct line of affiliation from that Christian nationalism of the 16th century, justifying Spanish imperialism, justifying the transatlantic slave thefts, to the decision in Johnson v. McIntosh in 1823 that paves the way for the Trail of Tears, to the genocides in this country, to slavery, to Jim Crow, to modern racism. All of this I see rooted in Christian nationalism. And when I'm talking about Christian nationalism, this is really the heart of what I'm talking about. It isn't just Christian, however, it becomes secularized. So by the time of the French Revolution, you've got Abbé Sieyès, the chief pamphleteer in some ways of the French Revolution, saying, the nation is prior to everything, it is the source of everything, its will is always legal, it is the law itself. That's an idolatrous view, in my opinion. That's saying that what law is whatever you can claim is congruent with the national will. And how do you discern what the national will is? Well, you suck it out of your thumb. That's the national will. There's no other way of determining it. If you've got military power, therefore, whatever you say goes. Whatever you say is not merely the way it is, it's the way it's meant to be. That's Christian nationalism. That's idolatry. That's plain and simple nationalism. That is the taproot of the strength of the Trumpists and the J.D. Vances and all of the rest of them. Somebody agrees with that or disagrees. I'm not sure.
That sounds like applause to me.
That sounds like an appropriate applause. I'll take it and run with it. Let me actually, it seems like a good segue, move into the prepared remarks that I have. Because I think it's not enough to just condemn Christian nationalism. I think one has to offer an alternative vision. And that's what I want to try and begin to do in this, and then turn it into a discussion and hear what other people think of what Christian nationalism is and how we might effectively combat it. So I call this attunement, being held, and the civic meaning of abundant care. We speak often of reform. We speak of healthcare reform, democratic reform, economic reform. We propose policies, we adjust incentives, we revise procedures, we attempt to fix systems that no longer seem to serve us. But before we speak of reform, we must ask a prior question. What is the human condition? If we begin from the modern assumption that we are self-originating, autonomous individuals negotiating power arrangements in a competitive world, then our civic architecture will mirror that assumption. It will be, at best, adversarial, procedural, compliance-driven, and perpetually anxious. But what if that modern assumption is wrong? What if it's false? What if the deeper truth is that we are beings who awaken within a field we did not create, a field that holds us before we act, that sustains us before we choose, that makes possible even our rebellion against it? What if we are fundamentally being held? Being held is an ontological condition. To say that we are being held is not to make a sentimental claim, it is to make an ontological one. We do not generate the ground beneath our feet. We do not summon into existence the conditions that allow us to breathe, to speak, to think, to love. The space in which we stand is given. The energy that animates us is given. The relational webs that sustain us are given. In the metaphysical language that undergirds this reflection, creation itself arises within divine love. Love withdraws to make space. Love transmits the flowing of spirit, consciousness, energy into time. Love holds the eddies that form galaxies, ecosystems, oceans, persons without domination. Each being is real and unique. Each trajectory is distinct, but none is self-grounded. If this is so, then the crisis of our time is not merely institutional failure. It is an ontological misrecognition of who we are that has culminated in an extreme forgetfulness. We've forgotten that we are being held. And when we forget that we are being held, fear rushes in to fill the vacuum. One of the deepest expressions of that fear in modern history has been the tendency of nations to treat their own power as sacred. When collective power becomes an object of worship, domination begins to masquerade as civilization. The result is a narrowing of the field of life. Lands become resources, peoples become obstacles, and the relationships that sustain life are gradually displaced by systems of control. Recovering attunement is therefore not only a personal humility, it requires not only personal humility, but civilizational humility. When power becomes an idol, the world grows small. When we return to the law of life, the field widens again. Attunement is civic virtue. If being held is the condition of existence, then attunement is the proper response. Attunement is the nurtured capacity to sense the fields in which we stand, the relationships that sustain life, the limits of one's own standpoint, the presence of others as co-bearers of reality, and the need to maintain right relations and how to do so. Attunement is neither passivity nor domination. It is responsiveness within belonging. Learning attunement is learning to sense and respond to this holding by maintaining and restoring right relations. Modern civilization has privileged a different posture. It has trained us in abstraction, control, competitive assertion. It has rewarded what can be measured and managed while discounting what can only be sensed and honored. The result is not simply political polarization or bureaucratic overreach, it is a civilizational distortion of attention. Without attunement, law becomes procedural dominance, medicine becomes disease management, education becomes information transfer, democracy becomes adversarial competition. With attunement, law seeks alignment with natural law, medicine nurtures the conditions of health, education awakens relational intelligence, and democracy becomes a transitional practice towards something deeper. Attunement is not a private spiritual luxury, it is a civic necessity. Ultimately, when being held is known and collective attunement is keen and sensitive, genuine self-government, like that of the native peoples before the Euro-Christian invasion carried out by America's forefathers and their heirs and successors, genuine self-government becomes a way of life that we can all enjoy. Abundant care as institutionalized attunement. When we speak of abundant care for all, we're often heard to be speaking of health care alone, or health care access. That is part of it, but it is not the heart of it. Abundant care is an institutional expression of being held. It asks, what would it mean for a society to behave as though it sees its members as already held in love? What would it mean to design systems that reflect abundance rather than scarcity, belonging rather than suspicion, responsibility rather than extraction? Such a society would treat persons not as isolated units, but as relational beings, recognize local communities as primary contexts of flourishing, protect ecological integrity as foundational to human health, and ultimately simply as respect for all our relations. Structure economic life around sufficiency and mutual thriving rather than endless accumulation and hoarding by the oligarchs. Abundant care is not generosity from the powerful, it is alignment with the abundance already woven into creation. Fear drives hoarding. Fear drives domination. Fear drives extraction. But if we are being held, fear need not be our organizing principle. Abundant care is, in this sense, structural fear reduction. Democratic recovery is transitional phase. Our present political system, even at its best, remains largely procedural. It manages conflict, it aggregates preferences, it arbitrates competing interests. When functioning well, it protects rights and limits domination, at least for some. That is no small achievement. But even a healthy democracy remains incomplete if it does not deepen in accordance with an accurate ontology. Democratic recovery, therefore, is necessary, but not sufficient. We must rebalance our modes of attention, acknowledge historical betrayals and distortions, restore trust through truthful reckoning, and redesign institutions to reward relational intelligence rather than pure technical mastery. Yet even this is preparatory work. It clears the ground. It does not yet plant the deeper seed. Genuine self-government. Genuine self-government is not majority rule or institutional stability, even within a context that respects political rights and civil liberties of all citizens and persons in accordance with constitutional law properly construed. Genuine self-government is a people ordering their common life together in alignment with the deeper patterns of reality. It requires recognition that we are being held, cultivation of attunement across differences, institutions that reflect relational ontology, and economic and legal forms aligned with natural law rather than with domination and extraction. In such a society, power becomes responsibility, freedom becomes right relation, law becomes articulation of alignment, and leadership becomes service to the living whole. This is not utopian fantasy. It is an aspirational realism grounded in metaphysical humility. We are not inventing reality, we are aligning with it. A regulatory ideal and a resilient horizon. This ontology serves as a regulatory ideal. It allows us to test reform. Does this policy deepen relational health or fragment it? Does this institution reduce fear or intensify it? Does this economic structure cultivate sufficiency or perpetuate extraction? Does this law align with natural law or distort it? If reform fails, if what Vanessa Machado de Oliveira calls the house of modernity continues to collapse, this ontology does not disappear. Being held does not collapse when institutions do. Attunement remains possible in small communities, in local councils, in networks of mutual aid, and in faith communities, in land-based gatherings. It remains wherever human beings know that they are not self-originating competitors, but participants in a shared field of gift. And here we must be especially clear. The resurgence of native peoples, once domination ceases and land bases sufficient for genuine self-government are restored to them, must unfold on their own terms. They are not instruments for our renewal. They are sovereign bearers of their own traditions and trajectories. If their example teaches the world something about alignment with land and natural law, it will be because they choose to live life freely and not because others seek to rely upon or appropriate their ways. This distinction matters. Right relation begins with respect. Our work. We are not constructing the universe. We are not engineering the sacred order of reality. We are listening. We are attempting to first remember and then sense and then know. We are seeking to design civic forms that reflect what has always already been true, that existence is gift, that differentiation need not entail domination, and that abundance flows where right relations are maintained. If we misperceive, the work will falter. If we align more closely, coherence will deepen. The test is not abstract consistency. It is whether fear recedes, whether trust grows, whether communities strengthen, whether land is restored, whether persons flourish. Attunement is the beginning, being held is the ground, abundant care is the civic expression, and genuine self-government is the horizon towards which democratic recovery might, with humility and courage, begin to reach. Thank you. Okay, now we can have a free-for-all. Either you want to go first?
I'll just start with a couple of remarks. Good evening, first of all. Glad to be here. Thank you, Steve, for the chance to be part of this conversation. It can be very difficult to tackle subjects like Christian nationalism. It's no light work. And even as you began tonight by saying you have some formations of ideas, but they're inadequate and insufficient, and asking the community for input in that regard, I think is great. Because these are such large things, and oftentimes we can feel as though they are so massive that they can't be solved, so why should we even try? Right? Conversations like these often just automatically turn people off because they're just like, you know what, that's too big, I don't want to deal with it, or it's too depressing because I can't see a solution. And so I just want to first commend your courage and commitment to say, yeah, this is big, I don't have a solution for it, but we need to tackle this. And I appreciate how you are beginning with acknowledging where we've been to fully understand, or to more fully understand how we've gotten to where we are. So one of the courses that I get to teach, that I'm teaching this semester at Boston University, is a course on race in America to first-year undergraduate students. So these are babies, 18-ish years old, right? And we're talking about how did we get to where we are now? Like, we look around the world and many of them can see that it's burning. It's a dumpster fire. And thinking on their lives, like, wow, it's been pretty rough, like as long as you've been alive, right? So to go back and reflect, and I'll get to my point, which is that many of them have said so far in the course, wow, why weren't we ever taught this, right? Like I thought, like sure, we talked about slavery, and yes, we talked about the Trail of Tears, and yes, we talked about these things in grade school, but not in the ways that they're being presented now. And it's in ways that you're presenting these ideas by saying that this is not the violence against indigenous peoples, the violence against African descended people, the violence, those things are not some distant past. One, they still occur today, perhaps just in a different format. And two, there is this through line that has connected all of these things. And one of those through lines being the role of Christianity in this country. And so I think that is helpful. The main point that I'm making is one of the ingredients I think that is required for us to advance a path forward is truth telling.
Amen.
For us to really examine the horrors of today and the past, but also today, right? Folks love to say, oh, well, slavery, that was back then. Or, oh, what happened in that was back then. And we're all fine now. We had Obama, right? That solved everything. And so, but to say like, no, there is a through line that is still connected to us today. And so those of us who are Christians, who profess that title, who profess that identity, we must wrestle with the fact that we are connected to that through line, right? And there are still ways in which we benefit from these things. There are still ways in which we are complicit. And so it is our work to do. And so I think that is a good starting point by telling the truth, making that connection throughout history. And I think that for me at least, puts fire underneath my feet, and adds fuel to that fire by saying like, well, I'm not some far removed person. I can't just say like, oh, I didn't do these things, or I didn't directly do these things, right? But I'm connected to it, right? And all of us are. And so I think that is a helpful frame.
Thank you.
As the only non-professor on the panel, I have the luxury of ignorance here, and I'm glad for that. I think I would say I'm really fascinated, Steve, by the way in which you can pinpoint the origins of American Christian nationalism. And I think that first and foremost, American Christian nationalism is, well, maybe not first and foremost, but it's an expression of whiteness. And I think, we have to recognize that, especially white Christians need to recognize that there is something unique about the way that nationalism and demonic religion express themselves in America, right, as opposed to other times in history. At the same time, I think we can really learn from other chapters in Christian history where the church has become demonically attuned, and look at the injury done to the church because of that. My interest is less in how do we present an alternative to Christian nationalism that is good for America, and more or democracy itself, and how do we preserve in this moment and advance a faithful church. And I think that preserving and advancing, working to preserve and advance a faithful church, as you just said, Luther, it must begin with an honest reckoning, right? And any pastor knows that, any human being knows that in order to move beyond one's own fallibility and sinfulness, and not spend the rest of your life determined by a crime or a wrong to someone else or yourself, that you, and I'm just talking about at the level of individual relations, right? To not have the rest of one's life determined by a sin of the past, you have to let yourself be forgiven. But in order to be forgiven, in order to let God be God, that has to begin with an honest reckoning with where you went off the rails, right? And so if you extrapolate that to the level of nation, a course like the one you're teaching ought to be mandatory for all American fifth graders, right? Or maybe younger, but we won't do that, of course. We're running in the opposite direction. And so I don't feel a whole lot of hope in that regard for our country, because we haven't yet shown a willingness to be honest. White America hasn't shown a willingness to be honest about the sin of whiteness, the sins of our past, the sins at the root of our nation. And I think that the church has an answer for that, right? It could. Imagine the great good that our Christian nationalist churches that fall into that category right now, could be, right, performing in the world, were they to take, and I could be naive here, but I honestly think that people aren't coming into church to learn how to be more violent Americans, right? Even churches, even Pete Hegseth's church, right? That's the bulk of wherever that guy goes to church. The bulk of the congregants in that church, they long for a connection to God. And it's a failure of their institutions and their pastors, right? At that, we long for God. God is frightening, right, at some level. And so we're going to always take what's easier, right? And so what's easier is nation. Right? So I think that how do we advance and preserve a faithful church? I think a part of it is, in a moment like this, and I don't think it ends with denunciation, but I do think it's incumbent upon all white pastors in America to denounce the demonic attunement of the majority of American Protestant Christians right now. To denounce our colleagues and to lay this out plain that what is happening is a rank idolatry, a betrayal of Christ. And in no small way a self-condemnation of the church, right? If you look at the most vivid example in recent history of what happens when the church forgets who it's worshiping, and what happens when Christians forget that the most foundational and constitutional part of our identity is Christian, right? It's interesting to me, like, as a white heterosexual man in America, I watch my fellows tremble and freak out right now about what feels to many of them like an assault on their identity, right? Question of whether that identity should be assaulted or not to the side. Why so fragile? Why so afraid? And the answer is, that's where their identity stops. White American straight male, right? But if we were to have an identity that both subverts, transcends, and precedes any of those labels, which is to say, if we really thought of ourselves as Christian, right? As people beloved by God, then the rest of it ought to, right? That's the stable identity, and that can't be taken away, right? So I think for the church, and I'm going on, but for a church like mine, again, if you look at the past, look to Germany, what happened there, right? The church committed an outrageous act of demonic faith, and in the process lost any claim it has on moral authority and on the capacity to be an authentic Christian community. And the German church has never recovered from that. Which isn't to say there's not hope. St. Paul's, where we're gathered here tonight, we've learned from the sins of our past, right? And one of my predecessors, we have long-standing pastorates at this church, so my predecessor's name was Tom, and he was here for 35 years. And Tom's predecessor's name was Frederick Trost. Fred was here for 25 years. The pastor prior to Fred, guy, I can't forget his last name, his name was John. He had the incredibly difficult task of succeeding a Nazi who was the pastor of this church in the 1930s. St. Paul's, as an immigrant church back then, was functioning as a German church in America. We flew the Nazi flag on our altar when Hitler called upon all the German Protestant churches to do that. Not every Sunday, I don't think, I don't know, but so what do we do with that, right? Well, what we don't do is pretend it didn't happen. And in owning that and being embarrassed and ashamed of it, right? But also realizing that God can redeem anyone. So then you look at where this church is now, right? And I do think where we're at now is, in no small way, a model of the kind of epistemological humility necessary for the church to actually be the church. And by that I mean the rank idolatry happening in American Protestantism right now is, in theological terms, an act of projection, psychological terms, an act of projection and idolatry. So what's going on is rather than being satisfied with the very little that we can know about God, what churches want to say is, now we can see how God's working, right? Because if you've got power, God's powerful, therefore God must be working through the powerful. Benjamin Franklin believed this too, right? You know, what's that famous thing he said? If a sparrow cannot fall, right, without his eye on it, can a nation rise without his blessing? It feels axiomatic, right? God must want America to be America, right? And it's a really gross misunderstanding of how the power of God works and where the reality of God lies. So I think that the church in America needs to be humbler. The white church needs to be humble, needs to be informed by blackness. Like, you know, and by that I mean by James Cone in no small part, right? By looking not to the centers of power for where the truth of God exists, but to the margins, right? To the historically despised, right? To the places where we want to say weakness lies, and the things we're afraid of lie, and look for God in those places authentically. That's not going to happen, you know. I don't think that's going to happen right now. Robert Jeffress, right, the Trump inaugural preacher, he's not going to see the light, you know. Not in this lifetime, I don't think. But I think, you know, there's hope for his church and that kind of Christian down the road, perhaps. I hope there must be. So I think the American Protestant church has within itself an alternative, and is within itself an alternative to Christian nationalism. And that has to begin with A, denouncing what's happening, and B, a radical humility that says there's far more about God that we don't know than we will ever know. One of the great anti-Nazi theologians, Emil Brunner, said, direct communication from God is always idolatry, right? Anytime you feel like you're hearing absolute truth from God as an institution, a nation, or even an individual, what you're probably hearing is your own desire projected onto a screen that you're mistaking for heaven, and then telling you what to do. In the case of nations, it's usually, in fact, almost always go kill people, right? And then once you get that divine sanction, you can do things that you would never have the moxie to do on your own. So if there's an alternative, I think that's where it lies, in the white church. But that takes, again, learning from blackness. How does the black church survive, right? It doesn't survive by being at the center of power. It doesn't survive by being told how great you are, or, you know, how great the black church is. It survives by faithfulness and perseverance, right? By being properly attuned to the gospel. And I don't mean to romanticize any of the black churches out there that aren't properly attuned to the gospel, but our partnership with Lighthouse, for instance, to me feels like a nice example of, it might look like we're doing you a solid, but in fact, what we're doing is learning how to be Christian, right, together, but you can be the teacher. And so that's my sense anyhow.
Thank you both. Let me add to what each of you have said and then open it up to people. So let me come first to Luther's point about the presence of all of this in the present, and then to Matt's question of how the church can, put this in bold terms,
I'm not
redeem
saying
itself.
you should run for the Senate on basis of your Christianity or your church.
Yeah, no, I'm
membership.
speaking more here in
that's
terms of my underlying ontology than as a candidate for Senate, although I'm both. In Arizona versus Navajo Nation in 2023, the Navajo Nation, which is in the Southwest where it's dry, says essentially to the United States, look, we have a treaty with you that guarantees us water. You're taking water from the Colorado River. We would like some of it. And the Supreme Court says, well, you may have a treaty right to this water, but the government's under no obligation to see that you get any of it. That is in the present what you're talking about. This is 3 years ago, right? The legal structures that sustained Jim Crow, that sustained slavery, that Christian nationalist idolatry is still at the basis of our legal relationships with the peoples of the native nations to this day. That has the potential, at least in my view of things, to spark the kind of outrage that Jim Crow sparked with the civil rights movement. The civil rights response to Jim Crow was to say that this law is hideous and intolerable. Our legal relationships with the peoples of the native nations are hideous and intolerable for the same reasons. It might be possible, in part on that basis, to build, especially within churches, an awareness that this is coming out of a variant, an idolatrous variant of Christianity, a demonic variant of Christianity, to use your term, and that it is incumbent on us to fight this with everything we've got on behalf of a very different vision of relationship. Now, that vision of relationship, I think, can extend beyond Christianity to, I have this handout, this mythology that I tell of the yes before time on the table behind people. I wish people would take a look at it. But what I'm saying is that we all have creational identities beneath every other identity that we have. And these creational identities don't threaten any other identity. We can hold to any identity that we wish to hold to and to our creational identity. But our creational identity means that we are brothers and sisters in creation. We were all given this beautiful existence. And we are all together in the beloved community formed by this beautiful existence. If we will see it in those terms, if we will see all life as sacred. And the peoples that I have learned that from most have not been Christian peoples, but have been native peoples. And I think as a Christian, I see within the native communities a deeper connection to the Christ that I know than I see in Christian communities. And I'm not trying to project onto them that, oh, they should think of themselves as Christians. By no means.
I've said this to you before, Steve, but George Lindbeck, the American Lutheran theologian who died a few years ago, he told me this wonderful thing one time. He said, Christians don't have all truth. God may well be speaking truth to Christians through other religions. What Christians have is the criterion of all truth, Jesus Christ. And what he meant by that is if a religious truth claim is being made to a Christian, you know, a Jewish person, a Hindu person does not need to be using Jesus as the criterion of truth. But for Christians, if a religious truth claim is being made that violates the criterion of Jesus Christ, it's a lie. So the notion, I would go so far as to say, die for your country, right?
It's a lie.
That's a lie. And if God can be speaking truth through other religions, if there are things you are learning about yourself, humanity, the earth, God, through Native American spirituality, that corresponds with the criteria, or doesn't violate the criterion of truth of Jesus Christ. That's true, and that's God speaking through that truth to some, right? I like that formula.
I like what he has said. I would modify it somewhat because for me, what I see is a deeper knowledge of the truth of, if one wants to put it in philosophical terms, what the logos is, what the structure of meaning in the universe is.
Let's save these arguments for my office. I'm kidding. Steve and I go around and around.
We go around and around about this kind of thing on a regular basis. But let me bring it back in a concrete fashion to something that touches more closely on politics. I remember a conversation with a Yakima friend of mine who said of a Christian friend of his that he had said to him, I'm a child of God at the deepest level. That's who I see myself as being. Who do you see yourself as being? And my friend paused and said, of creation. And I think that's a better answer. It's a more humble answer. It's a more accurate answer. It's an answer that speaks to the nature of Christ in my Christian view of things more accurately than the stock formula child of God does, because it sees all of creation as the offspring of this divine love and sees all of us as related to our brothers and sisters in all of creation in that way.
And if for a Christian, you're grounding what your friend said in the first chapter of Genesis, it's actually honoring God at a more foundational level.
Yeah. So I think we have within our traditions resources that we can call upon that can inform how we think about not merely forgiveness, but how we want to be in the world. Because if you're thinking about it in terms of, come back to America first, right? We're gonna put brutality and greed out into the world. What's gonna come back to us? Well, maybe we're gonna make a lot of money. That's the fantasy, I think, of a lot of people in MAGA. This Trumpist brutality and greed will produce the goods for us, produce the material goods for us. There's a hollowness in the soul that will come from that, guarantee it. Right? If you are making lots of money, you can buy things, you can consume things, but you can't cover the wounds in your soul that come from inflicting harm on your natives, on your brothers and sisters. Just can't be done. If you want to change that numbness that's going to come with that, you're going to have to not only ask for forgiveness, you're going to have to look within yourself to see how you can suffer the pain that you have inflicted on others. I don't believe in guilt. I think guilt is a counterproductive emotion. But I believe that there is, in shared suffering, a capacity to open one's heart and mind to alignment, and open one's heart and mind to acting in a different way in the world, in a more sensitive way in the world, in a way that is more attuned with right relations. And I think there are resources within Christianity, within Judaism, within Islam, within every spiritual and religious tradition that I've ever encountered that help us as a species draw upon these truths, on these spiritual truths, in ways that will enable us to mobilize ourselves for acting in different ways in the world, to act in more honorable, respectful, truthful ways that align with the harmony and balance and abundance that is actually written into the fabric of the universe. So let me see if you guys want to add anything to that, and then we'll open it up to questions, discussion.
I'm eager to hear from others.
So just in passing, most white people, or half, didn't vote. Young people are pretty much checked out.
Yeah.
The arguments you're making are for a specific segment of white people. I think there's room for Christianity to really reach these men and women and young people. You know, you go to these small rural areas, the trailers and all of that, there's room to move. And I don't think they're thinking MAGA, they're thinking getting high, they're thinking having fun. I mean, this is a good high level group, but the group you can really reach isn't MAGA.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Don't focus just on that group.
Yeah.
I think it's kind of you're losing.
Yeah.
That group's gone.
That's a good
But
point.
there's a whole group of young white people who are hungry for something other than drugs, porno, and hanging out.
Yeah.
That's the group you have to reach, and I really want to emphasize that.
That's a wonderful point.
And it's unfair to them. You know, one of the things we do in healthcare, we talk about, so there's race and class. We blacks are only 13% of the population. We are not 100% of the problem, right? There's, again, rural America has been forgotten by the urban left.
Yeah.
And that's where MAGA plugged in. I don't, you might be sort of my era, but in 1984, when Jesse Jackson ran for the first time, he touched rural America.
Yeah. Yeah. Didn't he win
Right
West,
there,
didn't he win West
he won
Virginia?
like all kinds of, which made the power structure freaked out.
Yeah.
This is a mistake. Not so. Part of your campaign has to be in Southern Illinois, as we talked about. So this is a mistake. On the left, for Physicians for National Health. So I went to the American Public Health Association. Lots of stuff on blacks and transgender and all that. This much on rural white America, which is 50% of the country. Mistake.
Yeah.
Opportunity.
Yeah.
So.
And I come from rural white
Even the
America.
white kids out here, yeah.
And I know that when what you're describing, the children of my friends who are in their 20s, they're not satisfied by the things you laid out that we're given, right, to satisfy and to entertain ourselves with. And and like any political movement in America that is in business for itself, they're smart enough to see the bullshit of the MAGA approach, right? So, and I think it's a mistake to think, oh, that's just, in our dumb bipartisan way, or our dumb two-party way, like, oh, that must mean an automatic default into the DNC. No, it's a spiritual hunger that's there,
It's
right?
a default into nothing.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, nihilism, right?
Nihilism is the biggest enemy right now.
Yes.
Yeah.
And just don't forget that.
That's really great, that's good.
Also, the black church has a lot of pimps and hustlers.
Oh, I know, yeah.
As you know. So let's not paint us as.
No, I don't mean to romanticize. What I mean is there is a model there for how to hold fast in the face of empire and corruption. I don't mean that all, yeah, I mean.
And we all come from Olduvai Gorge, right? We're all African, ultimately, right? Except for the Neanders. Right? But, so that's what I just would point out, is that there's a lot of white folks who are hungry, who need Christ, or need whoever, and young people especially, and you're gonna have to leave your churches, and you're gonna have to do like Christ himself.
Get
You're
up.
gonna have to walk in the streets.
That's great. Are you a physician?
I am. Now, in honesty, I'm searching through the Baha'i religion. I'm not there. I just finished the fast. So I'm kind of, but still I come out of Christian roots.
It does my heart good to hear somebody in healthcare have that kind of compassion. I think oftentimes the way that healthcare has been commodified, we can then look at physicians not as healers, right? Or not as people with a broad set of concerns for America, but just as yet another somebody else who's got their hand in our pocket, right? That there's a commodity exchange happening. So it does my heart good. Thank you, doctor.
So don't forget young white people. They're not all MAGA.
As we've said many a time, if you look by zip code, you can find white zip codes where the life expectancy is 10 to 15 years less than in other affluent zip codes.
But again, that story is not told by the liberal press.
No, it's not told by liberal press. Yeah.
Intentionally.
Yeah.
Okay.
Classic over race.
Thank you, Alan.
And that's one of the things too, if I can jump in quickly. An argument that I make often is that in this country, the construction of race, the process of racialization, the emergence of racism is largely rooted in economics. Foremost, greed, but by extension, economics, right? And so, what was the point of slavery? It was economics. What was the point of moving indigenous peoples from their lands? So we could have it and make money off of it, right? So this was all of these arguments where anytime there was a change, it's like, oh, we want this land, you can have this land. Actually, we want that land now. Oh, wait, there's water over here, we want that. Oh, there's oil here, let's go get that, right? So all of this and the ways to do that, right? So how do we, so it's like, I want this thing. So how do I then justify it, right? So then there are this number of processes that happen. There's this racialization. So we're gonna say that you're different or you're other. And we'll use something really easy, like phenotype. So we'll just use skin color. Like that's just an easy, it's a low hanging, we can just easily divide the room. If your skin's this color, you're over there, right? And then we started adding other things to it, and then we just kept adding language to it to try and solidify this really abstract thing. But all of this is rooted in, and so then what happens is when things start to fall apart, there's this fear, which I appreciate you mentioning in the class that I mentioned earlier. Right now, we're in our segment on whiteness, and particularly white fear and white rage that results. And I teach these things as two sides of the same coin, because when people can fear that they are losing resources or losing opportunities or losing, and so then if you can't have money, then it's like, well, what are some other things you can get? You can get power, you can try to get status, right? And so all of these things get co-opted. And when you feel that those resources, economic resources, power, status, those things are slipping away, fear ensues. And if you back people into a corner long enough, then they will lash out. And then, our system is so, well orchestrated that we sense that rage, we sense these things bubbling up, and then we say, oh wait, who should you be mad at? This group of minoritized people. Like your problem's not with these corporations and the banks and all these people that are working together to take your house from you. Your problem is with Latino people trying to work on the tomato farms. Like that's who your enemy should be. So that's who you should direct your rage toward, right? And so I think that it does require a level of, as was just mentioned a minute ago, empathy, right? And I always find it really unhelpful and unproductive to paint entire groups, especially political groups like MAGA, and say like they're all just terrible people, they're a waste, if you're, don't talk to me, you're just the spawn of Satan, right? And then we may have those opinions sometimes, right? But I don't find that to be incredibly helpful, right? Because I think with a level of empathy, I'm not saying we put up with crap, but empathy, a level of empathy to see that people are simply afraid. And that at a deep level, and that's why I appreciate the framework that you've laid out, on a deep level, all of us are yearning for and craving the same things. And when we feel that we're not getting those things met, fear ensues and rage follows. And what we see a lot, especially when it comes to Christian nationalism, and we see some of these just outrageous and outlandish things that are happening, acts, rhetoric, we see this, and it seems so vitriolic, right? It's really at its roots a lot of fear.
Yeah.
And if people could have those needs met, your framework of this is from abundance, right?
Yes.
Rather than believing the lie of scarcity, then we might be able to hopefully temper some of that rage. Maybe not eradicate the fear, but maybe we can temper some of that rage long enough to have some conversations, to be able to strategize and work together on figuring out how we can all get our needs met, because that's really all we all want.
Amen. Yeah. I particularly want to backing my concept of abundance, because it's not mine. I get it from the native peoples, right? And I get it from ecology. If you've got a forest, right, the sunlight is coming in, it's coming into the leaves are falling off and getting absorbed in the soil, the nutrients are coming up the roots of the tree is putting out oxygen that people will breathe. There is a cycle of aliveness, right? And it's that cycle of aliveness that generates abundance. Not abundance in the scarcity abundance sense, the economic sense of abundance, but real abundance, the abundance that sustains life. And that is what we have to show people we all have access to if we will participate in this circulation of aliveness. If we won't see it as, oh, I gotta hunker down, get mine because it's gonna get taken. I gotta hoard it, right? That hoarding, which is exemplified in the oligarchs and the way they act in the world, right? That's held up as some sort of a model. It's sickening.
Well,
it's
it is
sickening.
it is an expression of how we're all taught to think in our economy. And I think, Steve, I would encourage you, when you do talk about abundance, on the stump, right? That I think most of us are going to hear that as a matter of quantity, right? And like when Jesus says, "I came to give you life abundantly," he's not talking about a nicer car. He's talking about quality of existence, right? Luther, a question for you. Do you think that the kind of, and I agree with you that your point around fear and fear of deprivation and loss, but do you think as a pastor, like, all fear is a manifestation of this foundational fear of death? Does that resonate, do you think? Like,
in some ways, yes. Maybe not always like the physical death of like my physical existence ceasing to be. I think, yes, that can be one of the, like, one root or one area where that comes from. But I do think that there could be a fear of death of an identity, death of personhood, like death of and ideologies. Like, some people are so afraid of, like, even when I think of something like Christian nationalism, which to me makes no sense. I mean, I guess
it's just
scholarly,
drawn on its face,
right? Yes, in a scholarly, like, I get it from an academic standpoint, sure, but like I just don't understand how people take this on as it makes no sense to me. It's oxymoronic.
Right.
Christian national, but there are so many folks, even if you have the conversation of them, even if you pull the thread that's weakly holding together this ideology and it starts to fall apart, there is such a fear of even letting that go or that dying, because it's like, well, then what? So I would agree, even if not like the fear of death in the physical sense, but death of, well,
Erasure.
because it's like, if this ceases to be, if whatever this is, life, ideology, identity, personhood, if this ceases to be, I don't know what's on the other side of this. And that I can't deal with. I said in a sermon a few weeks ago, or whenever it was, many of us will embrace the familiarity of slavery rather than, we will cling to the familiarity of slavery rather than embracing the uncertainty of liberation. Because I don't know what's on the other side of that, I'm gonna cling to this, even if I know it's killing me, which is so ironic to me, right?
Which is why it's so essential to say we are being held.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe that particular rhetoric isn't the best rhetoric, but the truth of the universe is that we are held by love. And if we see that, we can build in accordance with the abundance that follows from that. Let me open it up to see if other people have thoughts.
We'll jabber on all of
I would only take issue with a statement that you said earlier about Germany not dealing well with the sins of the past. I think that they have far outstripped America
Amen. Yes.
in acknowledging their past.
No, they
sins
have,
and
without a
and
doubt.
their stumbling blocks and all of that. But my original point was,
I'm sorry, can I just clarify? What I meant was that I don't think it's any accident that the German Protestant church betrays itself and betrays Christ, God, and makes quite plain that all of its God talk is meaningless. And then the church never recovered from that. That the death of European Christianity, in particular German Protestant Christianity, that didn't just happen because we're getting increasingly secular. It happened because they shot themselves in the foot. And but the nation, would be a model for America, right? Yeah.
But let me take a second, Lee, and just emphasize this. That shooting ourselves in the foot has been going on for 5 centuries.
Yes.
Right? Modernity rests on a doubling down on moral depravity, and the name of that moral depravity that I've been using tonight is Christian nationalism. But the deeper truth of what you've said, Lee, is that the Germans did a better job of recognizing their moral depravity than we have. But our moral depravity is, I say this to people, I don't say it to shock. Andrew Jackson's America is at least as brutal as Adolf Hitler's Germany.
But my original point with the Christian nationalism, I'm just continuing to be so disturbed and perturbed by some of the statements and the expressions coming out of Trump and J.D. Vance and Hegseth and Kash Patel, these statements of a holy war with this Iranian affair. And it's so interesting to me that whenever we demonize another religion, Nation of Islam or Muhammad or anything, it always tends to be a religion of darker skinned people. It's so much easier to otherize and to make them the boogeyman, voodoo, Indian, Native American religion, Hindu. So just wanted to get your feeling on the kind of language that we're starting to hear.
I share your abhorrence to that language. It is hideous. The idea that we should be hitting them while they're down. That kind of pseudo-masculine bully boy rhetoric out of some kind of hidden gross locker room in America's soul. It's just disgusting. And the racial element of it is disgusting. The stupidity of thinking that you can behave in the world with such grotesque incivility. You see it in Trump's tariffs. I mean, this comes back to Alan's point about these tariffs as crushing rural America. Right? He's oblivious to that. He could care less about that. You know, he's just in it for his fantasy of masculinity. And the violence that's associated with that then gets sanctified by this pseudo-religious nationalism. It's true, as you're saying, that the greed is underneath this in a very profound way. But then we're going to sprinkle holy water on this greed. It's sickening.
And the holy water is like gas, right? I mean,
It fuels it, yes.
and it excuses it. And that's the thing, to your point, Luther, where it's like, how do we not see this? How do, and I'm equally mystified, how does anyone claiming to worship God and the crucified son of a carpenter, who told his own friends to put their weapons away when he was being unjustly arrested, because he was, I would say, ontologically incapable of violence, use that religion, use him to sanctify launching missiles? It's like 2 + 2 = 12. You know what I mean? How do you get there? I truly don't get it. And that's where I do think, and I agree, I mean, just yelling at people isn't much of a solution, but these pastors and preachers are going to have something to answer for. I mean, I've never felt more enthusiastic about God's judgment than I have in the last 10 years. I mean,
Great.
Just thinking about this kind of language about holy wars and the apocalypse and all this stuff. It's in wherever Revelations, wherever it is. It's really, for a lot of people, I think, justifying what's going on. They say, well, we don't have to, this is okay because this is whatever prophecy or whatever it is about written in the Bible. And it was just struck me your comment, Matt, about, I think it was Matt, about it being a form of idolatry to think you know what, this kind of prophecy idea, to think you know what God, what's...
and that you can engineer it somehow. I'm sorry, I cut you off. What are you saying?
Like, just the not knowing and honoring the mystery of things. That whole apocalypse story and the Holy War is not incorporating the mystery at all.
No.
And so it is sort of like this form of idolatrous kind of thinking of the... And I love the idea of this being of creation and this kind of more universal identity, like that people can belong to, or do belong to. You can remember, because I was once read about, like, well, how do you reconcile, like, when people have intractable conflicts that are based on identity, like Palestine, Israel, whatever, you know, these intractable things that are based on heels being grounded into stuck in the ground and who you are. Like, how do you make any progress on that kind of thing? And one of the ways I read that they've done a study on, and I can't quote from the report, but is appealing to a third identity that has nothing to do with these other two intractable conflict identities that they both share. And so this being of creation, or, you know,
Belonging. We all belong.
belonging, and even the Christian label or the Jew or the Islam, these are even separate. You know, they can cause these conflicts.
And they come after of creation. That's why I love that too. Saying that we are of creation does not cancel out I am a child
Anything
of
else,
God.
right.
It precedes it, right? And,
Right.
and if there weren't creation, we wouldn't be, right? It's a beautiful expression.
Yeah, and I'm thankful that you brought up Israel-Palestine, because it's something that people, I think, have a tendency to shy away from in politics. And so I want to avoid shying away from it. I want to say that what Israel has done, and I said this in the pages of Haaretz, an Israeli newspaper, in April of 2024, in Gaza is genocide, and what it's doing on the West Bank is apartheid, and this is completely unacceptable. But I also want to say that Israelis and Palestinians are both of creation, and they have to be able to see themselves, and we have to be able to see them as belonging to a common future if we're going to get out of this horrible mess that we're in, and the horrible mess that they're in, and the even worse mess that we're on the verge of as a result of what's going on with our aggression in Lebanon, in Iran, in Venezuela, in Cuba. There has to be a planetary sense of belonging cultivated that gets us out from under this nationalist frame.
And I love what, like along those lines, what Luther I think, was saying about, you know, it's not distance, it's not them and us, they're the bad ones, where they have the sense of, okay, there's a part of this, but how do you, and that's just what we're saying.
Yeah.
But this story, the apocalypse story, the Revelation story, there is so much account, like pastors, that's in the Bible, who are preaching that with enthusiasm, and it is, people are afraid, so they're latching on, they think, well, this is just the way it's gonna go, we're gonna go like zombies into this because it's preordained or whatever, it's written in the book, it's in the book. And it, like, people are just afraid, so they're attached to this brainless, not honoring the mystery of the world.
And it's this modern technological way of understanding how things work that we then take and put onto scripture. It's not actually in the Bible. So nowhere in the Bible does it say, pull this lever, launch this missile, topple this nation, and that will result in the second coming of Jesus. But that is the way that, right? So it's a mechanistic understanding that subjects God to our control, which is why I was saying earlier, and really do believe, like, the most faithful thing the church can often say is, we don't know what we're talking about. You know,
But we know that God is not a vending machine.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
But there should be some alternate, like you're saying, there needs to be not just a rejection of one story, but a another alternative.
Yes.
The story, and whatever it is, John, Revelations, whatever that is, the verse, whatever it is in the Bible, where it says that, like, that needs to be an alternative explanation or something, because this narrative that's being pushed, and so many people are just swallowing.
And we need to be courageous enough to criticize our own scriptures too. I mean, Martin Luther said, where scripture contains Christ, I'll preach it, and where it doesn't, I'll preach against it. And one way to look at Revelation is, the book of Revelation, is that that's a fear-based narrative written by a traumatized man for a traumatized community. It's a vengeance fantasy, right? It's not necessarily, which is to say there's not beauty in it, but it's not a prediction of the future, and it's not a guarantee that existence is going to end in a fiery cataclysm. Like,
I would say more than that. I would say that scripture, if it's to be understood, has to be understood in its totality, and has to be understood in terms of what the consequences of any interpretation of scripture are for the truth as we ascertain it. So not merely in terms of what the practical workings out are. If you think that scripture entitles you to go bombing all these countries and destroying all of this life, there's something wrong with your understanding of the Bible, in my opinion.
yeah.
You're just not seeing what is there. You're seeing what you want to project into it in order to do what you want to do.
Right. Scrape away these particular images, metaphors that the people of John's own time might have seen as applying to some particular political situations, right? That are long gone, right? And even then, were hard to interpret. And what Revelation is telling us is that history is in the hands of God, coming back to being held. And that in the end, heaven comes down to earth and all is well, right? And that's not happening on our timetable. And it's not happening because of anything we do either. We could, certainly, humans are brilliant. We could live out the vision that you're calling for, and that wouldn't be paradise. Do you know what I mean?
No, but
right?
it would be a lot better than what we have
Absolutely.
now, right?
Absolutely. I wish it would happen, but still, even then, there is a better ending for us, is what I'm trying to say.
Right, and a better beginning. I mean, this is why I keep coming back to this of creation, and I come back to the original free and independent existence of the native peoples. I'm not saying they lived in paradise, or they lived in the Garden of Eden. They didn't. But compared to what we have lived in, and what we're currently doing to the world, that's a whole lot closer to that than we ever have been.
And in terms of the kind of like isolated, sad lives people, younger people particularly, are living that the doctor was talking about, right? That, yeah, you compare the thought of, and many of us can remember these kind of, and some of us are blessed enough in churches and other places and family to be living in them still. These communities of mutual positive regard, safety. We know, you know, when you say being held is maybe a bad metaphor. If you've never been held, perhaps, right, that it doesn't resonate, but almost for anyone else who has in their body the memory of being held by a safe, loving person, it's deeply resonant. But yeah.
Yeah, it is a source of great joy to me that my mother is in the audience. I remember being held.
Who held you?
Yes.
Yeah, and now you can hold her.
Gladly.
It's interesting to me, Pastor Luther, that you had brought up the aspect of fear. You know, we are living in a time with a national leader, president, who has an almost reptilian sense of seeking out what people are afraid of and magnifying that.
Literally
and
capitalizing on it.
Capitalizing, literally. And with the solution that we're looking for being empathy expressed in Medicare for all, child care that people can afford, AID for HIV treatments, things like that. That's the antidote, and just wondering what you all think on that.
Okay, I'll say something because I think this is really important. Love opens up unexpected pathways, right? So I can't tell you how we go the next steps beyond. I mean, I can see a few steps that are practical that can be taken. I can't tell you where we would go if we were to take those steps, but I know opening paths would come from that. And we could continue to move in what would become a virtuous circle rather than a vicious cycle. So I take a lot of stock in that as being a source of hope and something even deeper than hope. Just knowing that this is the right thing to do.
I used to serve a church in one of the most affluent, it sounds kind of funny because now I certainly serve a church in an affluent zip code, but one of the most affluent zip codes in America. And I took the job because we didn't have enough money, my family didn't have enough money to buy groceries. And it felt like a logical thing, okay? I have this church I love that I'm serving. My wife and I are expecting our third kid. We couldn't afford childcare. For her to do meaningful work, for me to do meaningful work, and grow, you know, that's the crossroads we're at. So I look back on the decision I made to go make 5 times as much money doing the same work, and in the logic of America, of course that's what I would do, right? Who's not gonna do that? Then I got there and I was like, what have I done? You know, I was so out of place. But I did learn some things in that experience. It was in suburban Boston, in Wellesley. And one of the things that I saw was this phenomenon, and it tended to be men from white men from blue collar backgrounds who had bought into the American myth that the more money they accumulated, the happier they would be. And they were faithful people, and they at least had the wisdom when they hit the wall of that lie in their lives to know that there must be something else out there. But I was really surprised by the number of times that I'd had these conversations in my office where these men, I was there for 6 years, this probably happened a dozen times, where these men would come in, and they were very smart, and they were like little children. They would say, why am I not happy? You know, they were happy, and they had happy marriages, some of them, they're raising kids, beautiful homes, why aren't I happy? And it's like, it's not a helpful answer to say, well, you bought into a bullshit, harmful lie for your whole life. But that sense of it, right? If only I could have more.
Right, that's the false abundance. That's the heart of the problem at some level, is this notion that you can get what we acquire all as a gift by earning it.
Right, right.
But it's a gift. It's a gift to us in creation. It's a gift to us in Christ. It's a gift to us in our love for one another as beings who have experienced the gift of creation. We all have this gift. We can't claim it as something that we create, because we don't create it.
Right.
It's given to us.
Or that we even deserve, right?
Or we even deserve, but it's gift, and so of course we deserve to share it, because that's what we do when we're given gifts. We share them.
Absolutely. I do think there is a fear dimension to all of this, because it's like people want to it's like the pharaohs, you want to accumulate these edifices to yourself, and then you think somehow these edifices are going to manifest in eternity, right? But
Yeah.
Well, I want to throw something I know in this context is not going to be popular, but here we go.
Please.
What Pastor Luther mentioned earlier was truth. And I think what we lack is, and that's what you said, is that you didn't understand how people got or understood how they got their interpretation of scripture or how they see it the way they do. And I see it very clearly. Depending on the God that you've been taught, here we are. If Adam and Eve were laid into creation, one of the first things God said to do was to have dominion. And
well said.
so what do we get from that? Then fast forward, and God promises them Canaan. There are people there. You think indigenous people feel bad? Here the Israelites, God's saying go in. So the Amorites, the Jebusites, and all the people that were there, they have no rights according to the God we've been taught. So
I'm so glad what's your name?
Eric.
Eric, I'm so glad you mentioned this, because I was actually thinking, dare I raise this question in this conversation, which is there something in Christianity that lets itself go that way?
So let me answer this. No. Let me answer this, because this is a perfect point.
Let me finish.
Okay, you finish, Eric, and then I'll
I'm
jump
saying
in.
to you, I see very clearly in Scripture
The roots of this.
how they got there.
Yeah.
So from the beginning, you are supposed to have dominion.
Yeah.
Then later on, if this is what I perceive God promises me, I just go in and take it. It's mine. And who's gonna stop me? Or as they say, who's gonna check me?
Yeah.
So
And for me, the term Christian nationalism, I have a problem with it because the Christ has been removed a long time ago. So it's more like a nationalistic Christianity than a Christian nationalism.
Right.
Because there's no Christ in it. If you actually put Christ in it, it doesn't make sense.
And to answer your own question, you know the answer to this already, Eric, but who's gonna stop me?
Yeah.
Well, I do think that's part of the reason God reveals himself more plainly in Jesus than in any other way. Jesus is the God with us in one who suffers, dies, and chooses not to pick up arms. That's for me, that's how I can, knowing, Scripture well, obviously, and haunted by that question, is there something rotten in this thing? Because this has happened already. What America's doing right now, it's been going on for 500 years. Maybe the issue is not idolatrous Christianity, maybe the issue is Christianity, right? For me, well, I still need to buy groceries, so, but honestly, the irony of ironies, look, the salvific dimension in it is Jesus. I think there is a self-corrective dimension in Jesus that goes back and addresses some of those haunting and harmful things that are in Scripture, both before him and after him.
And for me, what Christ offered, to partner with the domination, was a reflectiveness. Because a nation that has been traumatized, you have to be able to truth tell. What has this, and of course they didn't have this language at that point, but people respond to trauma in different ways. So you either respond with fear, and then the fear causes you to do something, or you respond in a way, you go in or you go out. So you go inward, and you're depressed, and you isolate yourself, and then that produces a different kind of result, or you become angry, and you begin to take out what your insecurities are, what your things that you should be doing to correct, self-correct. It's all someone else's fault. It is easier to project upon someone else what you need to do to forgive Mama. Mama didn't hug me enough. Or Sally, my sister slapped me several times when I was a kid. And rather than tell the truth about that, even within our family units, we project that onto everyone, and then they project it. And so it becomes, and then you partner scripture that says, have dominion, we can take, we serve a God of boundaries. So then, depending upon, I can see very clearly how they got there.
Yeah.
The point is, as Pastor Luther said, when can we pause a minute and do what Christ did and say, we need to stop, let's reflect, and redirect.
Yeah, change.
And change, like the Syrophoenician woman when he called her a dog.
Yeah.
But then at the end, he never called anyone else that again.
And so, if God Himself can have the humility to do that,
but self-correct and be redirect yourself.
Yeah.
He didn't say anything to the Pharisees about that. He didn't say that was Jesus saying, got it.
Right. I'm learning a lot tonight, but one of the things I'm learning is I'm coming away from this jealous of the kind.
So let me add a point to this, Eric, from a native activist named George Manuel, who's head of the National Indian Brotherhood that's now the Assembly of First Nations. And he says, perhaps when they stop trying to have dominion over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and every living thing that liveth on the earth, they will stop trying to have dominion over us. It will be much easier to be our brother's keeper then. Because the answer to what you're saying is in Scripture from the very beginning, right? I mean, the nature of the relationship between Cain and Abel. Am I my brother's keeper? Well, yes, you are your brother's keeper, right? And you better learn that. And if you don't learn that easy way, you're going to learn it the hard way, but you're going to learn it. And that message is there throughout the text and throughout the tradition for those who have, eyes to see and ears to hear. And the problem that we have had as Christians, and I think this is a problem that isn't just a problem of Christian nationalism, I think this is a problem of people who are genuinely seeking to be non-idolatrous Christians, is that we have not seen Christ in our neighbors, and in particularly our native neighbors. And if we were to do so, we would learn an awful lot about Christ from them.
But what if we don't see Christ even in our pulpits?
Right.
Let's not even,
I hear you.
I'm just asking the question. If, since the subject tonight is Christian nationalism, what if Christ isn't in the pulpit? You can't blame that on Satan. It's not demonic. The person there has made a choice.
Right.
And Satan is like, well, hey, since you helped me out, cool. But
I used to phrase demonically attuned, and but what I meant by that was that these preachers are, and again, I'm not saying I am perfectly attuned to the truth of God. That's why I'm talking. I know I'm not. That's why I'm talking about the need for a foundation of humility as a preacher. But these preachers are attuned to, I don't think it's Satan working his wiles and making them do this, but rather they're attuned to a lie and then calling it something else, right?
They not only are attuned to it, Pastor, I would say they embrace it.
And it enriches
them.
them.
Because they made the decision that, and I forget where the text is, where they would rather believe the lie because the truth is more difficult, which goes back to what Luther says. And so if we are going to have relationships with one another, family and churches and extension, then we have to be able to tell one another the truth, even when it
Hurts.
is painful, and I'm reticent to use that word, but when it is unpleasant.
Mm-hmm.
Because
Both-
then
yeah.
because then you can, it's like if you walk around with a growth, but you won't go to the doctor because you don't want to know
Mm.
what it is,
Yeah.
and it continues to grow. By the time you know, then
It's gonna kill you.
Yes,
Yeah.
but so your avoidance of it does not change the fact that you had it.
Right, right.
And so by the time, but when the doctor gets to it, he's like, there's nothing else we can do. And I feel like if we don't redirect in the nation, since in my opinion, Christ has been taken out of it.
Yep.
If we don't put Christ in it soon,
Yeah.
it'll result in us being in a space where it's gonna be really hard for us to recover.
Yeah.
I
I think we're already in that space. I think that there are
think we're gonna
paths
be
back.
collapsing for a long time.
I think there are paths back to earlier versions of Christianity in American history that were less idolatrous.
Mhm.
And I know that sounds strange to us because we have this background notion of progress, right? But I think there were people at the time of the framing of the Constitution and the founding of the country who understood that slavery was wrong, who understood that the native nations had the rights of full and equal sovereigns,
Even though they partook.
even though they participated in a political order that excused those things, that appeased those things and the people who advocated them. There was a hypocrisy there. Yes, I don't want to underemphasize. I gave this talk. It's on my webpage on We the People Between Immanence and Transcendence. And one of the things I point out in that is that James Wilson, who's one of the people I'm thinking of when I think of this, was essentially asked whether women could come into his law classes. And he gives this bullshit answer that is, no, you've got a higher calling. You're most beautiful when you're in the domestic sphere. That's more important than public law and public government. And it's just a bullshit answer, right? If he had taken a different stance then, he would have opened doors that would have rippled through the future, right?
But he knew his own answer was not.
And he probably knew his own answer was bullshit, probably. John Adams didn't. When Abigail Adams told him what he should do, John Adams, in writing the Massachusetts Constitution in 1780, writes out of it that women of independent property can vote. So women could vote in colonial America in Massachusetts if they own property in their own name, and John Adams changes that. Right? But so I don't want to exaggerate the extent to which there are. What do I want to say? I want to say that Abigail Adams, when she says we can take your natural and legal authority without violence and throw it at our feet, she's saying something there that has resonance to the present. There's been no progress in terms of the image that she sets out for what justice would entail. Right? There's been regress when it comes to the rights of the native nations. There's been a civil war fought over slavery, so there's been some effort to at least acknowledge the evil. But we need to look at this history as a whole and to find within it where the places are that we made our most serious mistakes as a people, and begin to open ourselves to grief over those mistakes, and to open ourselves to listening to the truth that's embedded in those mistakes. And I'm not saying to fix it, because fix-it mentality often just messes things up, right? I'm saying to sit with the suffering.
Just pause.
To pause, and in that pause, some space will emerge. And that's really what love is it's a gift of space. That's what Bell Hooks says, it's what I believe love is, and that's what God gives us in creation, and that's what we give each other when we make room for each other.
Yeah.
And out of that, we can get it more and more spacious.
If Christ took on the sins of the world, which is what, then it's plausible that he would have to go away to pray.
Yeah.
That he would need some solitude to say, what is this? And to cry out.
Yeah.
That you need that time to say, what in the heck am I doing? What is this? And then come out.
So interesting too, because our economy wants to take that away from us. We
Yeah,
can't
yes.
it's actually, it doesn't feel like, if you had told me 20 years ago that being reflective, doing nothing, was a skill, I would have been like, it's my default mode. What do you mean it's a skill? Now it feels like a skill we're losing. It's,
Because anytime Jesus was about to do something,
he always did that.
he went away. He had this.
But anytime we're doing it, we're not
Being
making
productive.
money or we're not making money or we're not spending money. We're not, I can look at my phone all day long and somebody's benefiting from that, right? Speaking of doing things to make money, I have to go walk the building and make sure everybody. But Steve, I just want to say, thank you. It takes a lot of courage to stand up and speak the truth, to offer up an alternative vision to, there's many different ways to look at your candidacy, I think, right? But one essential way is to look at it as an act of planting seeds, as you referenced earlier. There's not very many people, in fact, I'd like to meet the others, I doubt that there are, who have your intellect and fire, who are willing to step out into the public square and offer up an alternative to the meaningless alternatives that were often presented, to try to really find some deep meaning in our process. It's very hopeful, it's a hopeful act. I feel proud of, your mother is probably the most proud of you here in the room, but I feel proud to know you. I know, and I think Luther and I, both of our congregations can feel proud to have you as a leader amongst us, and as you hone these arguments and take it out, right?
Yeah.
Probably the less sympathetic audiences, I would imagine. God bless you. I would pray.
Well, thank you. I will say that in talking about this with people, I get a lot of positive energy and a lot of positive responses when I talk about these things.
I think
There's a deep resonance in the people that I've spoken with in the city about these things.
Yeah.
So I think there's a hunger out there for it.
I like this notion from the physician who left earlier, what would happen if the three of us went to Centralia with this?
Yeah.
Do you know what I mean? To a public library.
Yeah.
There's some truth.
Yeah. I'll take you up on that as an offer.
Thank you, everybody.
Well, did you have a comment or a question?
I feel like I might have gotten the answer. I've heard of Christian nationalists via TikTok, but so my question was, do Christian nationalists know that they are Christian nationalists? I think I'll let y'all talk, but I'm like, I think I got the answer. I'm not sure.
Do they self-identify?
I think they think of themselves as Christians. I don't think they.
Some do.
Some do. Okay, that's true.
It's kind of like, still want to make this correlation? Sure, why not? It's like asking, do racists know they're racist? Right? And so some do. They're like, yeah, absolutely, I sure am. Right? But and others, no. And this is what happens when identities get conflated, right? And I talk about, when I teach specifically on race and whiteness, and we don't have time to go into this, is a whole other thing, but whiteness as an ideology, not a skin color, right? And it's not that, it's not even about white people, it's about an ideology of whiteness. An ideology that says that there is an ideal archetype, there is an ideal type of person in the society, and if you hold it as close as you can get to that ideal, the more value you have, right? So if you're not, it's not just white, but it's the right kind of white, that's also male, cisgender, heterosexual, Christian, rich, the right, all of these, and the closer you are to that, the more privilege you have in the society, right? This idea of whiteness. And what happens is when all of these things get conflated together, and people will think of it as, I think somebody said that they just think of themselves as Christian. It's like when certain things become a default, right? Then it can get coded in particular ways that we don't often see. So then, rather than Christian nationalism, folks will talk about Christian values or even American values, right? We want to defend traditional values. So these other sorts of this other language it's coded, and some folks don't even see it because it's so default. And that's why even with, and it's interesting because Christian nationalism, you have folks it's like on the one hand, people can on the Christian side of things say like, oh well, I'm following the mandate of God, right? And those will be the same folks that'll say like we got to keep politics out of the church with big American flag just hanging up there. But then at the same time with their politics, can say, well, this is political, like we're defending traditional values, or those people are being un-American, right? And so like these things get really conflated in really interesting ways that allows them to, for many I would say, to see them as separate, right? Because in their view, it's still this separation of church and state, but it's not really. Because we're not calling a thing, then we don't see the ways in which they're being really conflated together in nefarious ways.
And I would just add to that this conflation in nefarious ways, we are all complicit in because of the depth of, it's not just whiteness, the depth of Christian nationalism in the constitution of this society. Our property law embeds it. Every time a house is sold, we don't think about anything about the title search, there's gotta be a title search, right? Where does that title search go back to? It goes back to Johnson v. McIntosh in 1823. It goes back to the fact that representatives, allegedly, according to the Supreme Court, of a Christian people saw this land with their magic Christian eyes, that they acquired ultimate dominion to it and title over it, and that's where title comes from. And I'm not trying to take anybody's anything. I'm not trying to take anybody's property. I'm trying to say we should have enough of a sense of justice and the injustice of what we've done, that we at least return to these peoples enough land that they consider it enough to redeem, to recover their own free and independent existence on it, their own genuine self-government on it, that we stop trying to dominate them and stop trying to dominate their lands, that we say, this isn't gonna make everything right, this isn't gonna fix things, this is just a small step toward justice, but we can make this step toward justice as a society, and it can open the path to deeper justices, to deeper progress. I mean, I don't like the word progress, but to the movement toward right relations that we as people among other peoples need to have with all the other peoples who live on this continent with us.
And I think the language of progress gets on my nerves too. But I think the underlying sentiment is good, right? So you said take a step. We got to keep taking steps.
Yes.
Right. The problem is we'll take a step. We've already given you this. Like, what else do you want, right? We actually recognize you as human beings now. I mean, what else do you want from us? And even I feel like your comments earlier. I'll wrap up because I know we need to leave. I think you're far more generous than I am of looking on, reflective of history and how folks even during slavery thought it abhorrent, and which is true. But one of the things that I would argue is that an issue that plagued even those movements, those abolitionist movements, was that even though folks were against the institution of slavery, they still didn't see indigenous and African people as equals. And so what happened was, when we get to Fear and Rage, was, yes, slavery, this is a terrible thing, this is inhumane, this is probably against God, like we should probably stop. At first it was stop buying slaves. It's like, but you're not gonna make me get rid of the ones I have now, right? It's like, yeah, you should probably do that too. Okay, I guess. But there was never, I would argue, for many, if not most abolitionists of the day, this sense of, now we can all be united together as siblings, as equals. And that was a problem. So then when in the freed Africans were like, well now, yeah, we want equal standing in society, I said, whoa, we never thought about it. No, that's not what we meant. Like, no, that was not, no. So you need to know your place. Right? Like, even though, yes, you can be free from the physical change, but that don't mean you can come over here and riot. Right? And so it's that one of the things that I will say is that even when we have conversations about how do we combat some of these deleterious, nefarious, sinful, to use Matt's term, demonic systems, it's not enough just to tear those things down, right? To say that these things were wrong or these injustices are wrong, but to your point, when we see ourselves as of creation and that we are all of creation and we see the humanity of other people, that is the framework that is
Yeah.
needed beyond just the step of let's eliminate one of these barriers.
Thank you. I deeply appreciate that because I don't want people to misunderstand that when I look towards somebody like Wilson, I'm looking for anything more than hypocrisy, because it is hypocrisy. And yet what Jesus says is, right, what they say, not what they do. So when you say that slavery is repugnant to natural law, okay, we've got a basis for conversation there, right? That's as far as I want to go on that. Yeah.
I got you.
Anything else from anybody else? Thank you all for this. This has been a great conversation. I've learned a lot from it. Hopefully yeah. All right, I'll turn off the recording and we can have some cookies and coffee and whatever else people want to do.